And hello to all of you. Happy to be here. I've heard great things about this group through my work in the Puerto Rico working group, and so I'm happy to be joining you all. Just a little bit about the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition. This was an idea that kind of germinated in the response to Hurricane Katrina when we, the National Low Income Housing Coalition, was working with our advocates and partners on the ground during that disaster. And we realized there was a deficiency of, people that had expertise in housing, working in, disaster recovery, that there was a need there. So while learning, gradually over the course of multiple disasters, we have just learned more and more about disaster recovery. We continue to approach it from a houser perspective. But I think we currently have a group of over 850 state, local, and national organizations from across the country, and maintain a full suite of different calls addressing different aspects of disaster recovery. And I think what that does is it allows people from disparate disaster areas that might not otherwise connect with each other to do so, share best practices, as well as identify, ongoing issues. Like if the issue is the same in Houston as it is in Northern California, then that's a programmatic failure. That's something that we as advocates need to be addressing. So yeah, and after this, I'll make sure that folks have the link to get connected to the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition. I have been at this 2 years, and I'm always learning from all these excellent advocates and lawyers and experts that are on these calls. So I always try, and I'm just teach me. So please join and teach me more things about emergency management. But yeah, so for this report, it's the Reforming Disaster Recovery. It's linked with a convening that we held in Houston, Texas, late last year, and that had about more than 60 different disaster recovery advocates, community organizers, lawyers, and such. And we had brought them together to kind of envision disaster recovery. Now, we did that because we often hear that emergency management as a discipline, is populated by experts in emergency management alone. However, I think recognizing the holistic nature of what disaster recovery requires necessitates that additional disciplines, take a active role in ensuring that recovery is equitable, just, and does not simply replace the inequities of the society prior to a disaster. So, I think as we see now, our emergency response system is, in a bit of a free fall. Forgive me, FEMA folks on the call. And I think I was speaking to some of our partners in Northern California that were just shocked at, having additional fires hit areas that had suffered during the 2017-2018 California wildfire season. I think they were just, beside themselves in that, they're just like, we're making the same mistakes. We're just simply repeating what we did last time that we know is inadequate. So I think, we need a wholesale reimagining of the goals and the processes by which we accomplish those goals when it comes to disaster recovery. I think we need to reimagine what that looks like for today, and reimagine that with full sail knowledge of, the iniquities of current society, and how do we address those inequities, while at the same time confronting climate change in the years ahead. So I think that's a climate change imperative, and I think that's a human rights imperative to in addition to ensuring that, vulnerable populations do receive the assistance that they need to fully recover, I think also we should keep in mind that, simply rebuilding back an unequal, community is not a success. It's actually a bit of a missed opportunity, that, just to replacing a community that was profoundly changed by and laid out based upon the principles to like a Jim Crow style laws and things like that. That isn't a successful recovery. We need to move beyond that to think about how we are really going to ensure that everybody in our society can, confront climate change and succeed. But enough waxing philosophically for me. I just wanted to talk a little bit about kind of the methodology of this Houston convening that I mentioned before. So that was in October of last year. Over 60 activists, researchers, and advocates and lawyers all working kind of within disaster recovery and within their own fields. Just a quick shout out. It was co-hosted by Texas Housers, which is an excellent organization down there in Houston. I encourage you to check them out. And they were actually able to set up a tour of areas struck by Hurricane Harvey, areas at risk of flooding. That included, single family neighborhoods, as well as, HUD funded affordable housing. We were actually even able to see a Rapido house, which is a quick short to medium term housing solution that was kind of a pilot was deployed in Houston after Hurricane Harvey. And that kind of was able to jog all of our gears and get us into the right disaster recovery space to talk about these issues. So the 3-day convening, it had multiple breakouts. We curated it to ensure that there was somebody from each discipline in each of the working groups. And these discussions were framed by part one of the report that Evis had mentioned, and included a screening of multiple short films having to do with historically vulnerable populations dealing with disaster recovery. So it was a good time. I just wanted to talk briefly about just kind of difficulties in throwing this report together. Given the interconnected nature of disaster recovery, I think it was hard to talk about and frame each stage of disaster recovery separately, because of course they are all very much interconnected. How well you respond during the emergency response phase directly affects, your short-term disaster recovery phase, and how quickly you can get folks into, emergency short-term housing certainly affects the long-term and the mitigation stage. And it's more circular as opposed to linear, I think. And that made it difficult to kind of talk about each stage of recovery in a silo. But I think by, organizational requirements and just in terms of trying to create a solid product, I think was, we had to, in a way, talk about it siloed off like that. So it was also difficult to frame the conversation as a reimagining. I mean, it's hard to grasp for folks fully. It was hard, of course, all of the people that attended the convening were committed to the idea of disaster recovery reform, but after working within the system for so long, I think it's hard to really grasp a blue sky approach, a let's see what we can do if we were able to rebuild the recovery system based upon equitable principles. And I think that was a bit difficult for some people. And I think it actually made the report, surmounting that challenge actually made the report better, because some of the suggestions, of course, are, almost Hail Marys, while others, could be accomplished, this very second, if the political and policy will was there. Next up, there was just a massive amount of potential reforms. You should have seen the length of the first draft of this. I think it was double the size. So it's hard to parsed down to just a bite-sized product that would actually be useful to a wide range of audiences. So I just wanted to briefly touch on, nominally I'm talking about the second part of this report, which is the reform recommendations, but I wanted to touch on part one of that report. And that objective, the objective of that report was really, I called it an airing of grievances, where we kind of laid out what we saw as the largest and most important failures of the current disaster recovery system, both at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level. And that kind of allowed participants to start on the same page in their discussions. And, it covers issues in access to resources for low-income households, issues with recovery strategy, disparate impacts, and more. And I didn't want to go too much into it because I think in some ways I'm preaching to the choir when it comes to problems that we have with federal disaster response right now. But I'll make sure that folks get a copy of that report. I'll touch upon some of those issues specific to Puerto Rico, and at the end of my spiel. So for part two, for those looking at it, these reforms are consensus-based solutions. These were all discussed by each of the working groups in the convening. They were put together by us at NLIHC, as well as the Fair Share Housing Center of New Jersey. Shout out to Dave Ramler. Who I'm not sure if he's on this current call, but he was certainly on the call that that made me late for this call. And we kind of were attempting to create those disparate ideas and innovations and kind of place them into a broader framework for reform that advocates can use to argue at all levels of government. Just talking about let me go find them. Scrolling through. So we identified amongst all of the recommendations that came out of the convening kind of a series of policy themes. First and foremost, it was robust resident and community engagement. I think, there's an idea that somehow, recovery experts should be above all else listened to when it comes to disaster recovery. However, I think that idea ignores not only the value of anecdotal information about how a disaster is affecting a certain area from the perspective of people on the ground, but I think it also closes out an important resource that organically produces itself during a disaster recovery, and that's just that residents after a disaster, are more likely to help themselves or help each other. I think they view it's a community response to a disaster. I think one of our speakers at the convening from West Street Recovery in Houston said, imagine what we could do if, everybody acted the same way they did the day after a disaster. We could probably fix a lot of substantial issues in America if everybody had put aside their day-to-day biases and things like that to work together towards a common community goal. And I think that impetus, that human impetus to do so, I think is ignored in a lot of local responses to recovery. And I think that's a wasted resource. That's leaving points on the field, if that's an analogy. Additionally, there was also a strong vein of systemic transparency. Data transparency, it's critical to ensuring informed public policy decisions, and also encourages just greater public participation in disaster recovery efforts, and helps us as advocates better identify the gaps in services and the gaps in needs for future disaster recovery efforts, as well as in real time on the ground. You know, it's always a battle to get correct, or at least like fully fleshed out data sets from recovery agencies. And that really puts us as advocates, you know, makes our jobs all the more harder, because we're being forced to kind of uh, not guess, but in find implied areas of need and look that much harder on the ground for where that need is. Whereas had we, if we have access to that data that it is being collected, or at least should be being collected during a disaster, whether it be outcome data or IA application data, all IA application data and things like that, you know, we would really be able to nail down the more minute reasons why disaster recovery fails and how to implement quick fixes to ensure that it doesn't fail. I also just wanted to briefly touch on, actually, hold on, I still had 2 left. Okay. I had a bunch left, actually. So also, additionally, I've been talking about equity this entire time. You know, I think America's disaster framework as it stands today exacerbates and reinforces that racial, income, and accessibility inequities at each stage of disaster recovery. So you have the lowest income survivors, including, you know, seniors, people with disabilities, and people experiencing homelessness, are consistently excluded from disaster housing response and recovery efforts. You know, shout out to the Civil Rights Office at FEMA. I always think that y'all do a very good job in ensuring that the disability community is included in FEMA programs and such. But I think there needs to be a wholesale reimagining of how we value those lowest income survivors when it comes to disaster recovery. You know, people experiencing homelessness, you know, if you are able to show that you lived in a tent prior to a disaster, you are able to receive initial rental assistance from FEMA after a disaster. But if you did not live in a tent after, or could not show that you lived in a tent before a disaster struck, you will not receive any assistance from FEMA in terms of housing. And I think that kind of typifies where some aspects of disaster recovery are siloed off. Me as a houser, I've never seen any distinction made before about people or individuals experiencing homelessness living in a tent versus an individual experiencing homelessness that lives, you know, directly on the street. That's kind of a very manufactured division that I think kind of reflects a desire to somehow not give individuals assistance when they need it because of the priorities and the goals of our current disaster recovery system. So I think if we change that around to continue using that example, I think if we valued equity and we valued a just recovery, we would ensure that the lowest income survivors, the individuals experiencing homelessness that survive that experience the disaster, would receive assistance to fully recover, even beyond, and create a condition that they can recover even beyond that which they were experiencing prior to a disaster. Next, there is, you know, fair mitigation practices, and I think this is more, y'all would be more of the experts on this than myself, and you know, again, a shout out to Dave Ramler for being our mitigation expert when we were writing this report. But I think the report recommendations really stem around conversations with communities, ensuring that such programs are culturally competent in order to ensure that communities that may be, for instance, being considered for a buyout are able to trust the administration facilitating that buyout program. that they, are able to adequately recover, or that they're able to attain the same level of housing when they do take the buyout, and things like that, just to use one example from the report for that. So that's kind of that fair mitigation practices, and it comes down to a group in Houston working with Texas Housers. I sincerely apologize that I do not remember the name of the direct organization right now, but they rolled out what they called the four rights when it comes to community development. I think the four rights apply a lot to mitigation practices, and that's the right to leave, the right to stay, the right to choose, and the right to have a say. So that's the right to leave a community that is under direct threat from a disaster. That's the right to remain in a community even though it is affected by a disaster, or is at risk of a disaster. I think they have a right to adequate and substantial public communication about mitigation practices. And I think that they, and they need to have a real choice, and not a choice where, not a choice with backs up against the wall, but a real choice in how they want their community to mitigate and to deal with, the effects of climate change and disasters. And I think that's, a powerful lesson, I think, for Puerto Rico, and for, folks that are working on CDBG program, disaster-related CDBG programs in Puerto Rico, is really that ensuring that those four rights are there and programmatic and being enforced, will make a better recovery for everyone. It may not, be easy, but that is the work that must be done in order to ensure a just recovery. And finally, it also talks about increased local capacity and benefit. So just as kind of individuals after a disaster tend to have community goals in mind, tend to be more social, tend to help out each other, and that is an underutilized resource, I think so too are these, what we call kind of the scrappy grassroots folks, like, a West Street Recovery in Houston, where they have a small imprint, but but within that imprint, they have been on the ground for years doing a wide variety of work. And I think, these community-based organizations, they have an intimate awareness of the unique needs of their community, especially the lowest income members of their community, and are often in the best position to engage with them. So these orgs do not receive support needed after a disaster to quickly scale up their efforts, which I think is an issue, in that you're relying on more so out-of-town contractors without kind of utilizing the informal and formal connections that these community-based organizations already have. You going back to West Street Recovery, their biggest issue directly after the disaster was they needed money for more drywall, because they were just going in and, as folks were denied FEMA IA, they were coming in and, reapplying drywall, they were fixing roofs and things like that. And they were utilizing local contractors to do it. And they, their biggest thing was, we need funds for, construction material, and we need funds for informational flyers and various other things. And I think that kind of struck me as a underutilized resource, where instead of doing that, we're essentially recreating exactly what these community-based organizations are doing directly after a disaster. And even in terms of CDBG, DR public participation, like, these groups are really at the forefront and would be the groups that you want to directly you want to have them direct your public participation program to ensure that, that folks are actually being listened to, instead of seeking to rebuild those informal relationships within a community directly after a disaster in a high stress situation. So I think that is really it. There's a bunch more. I know I didn't go into too much detail, but I'm sure you all have questions to ask me. But you know, specifically from Puerto Rico, I think our ongoing saga talking about title issues with FEMA IA is substantial. I think about the efforts to ensure that there was public participation in recovery programs in Puerto Rico was really really informative to us, and they continue, and those lessons continue to help out individuals across the country. And so I wanted to thank all of you advocates for Puerto Rico for that, because I think it's it has been a long struggle. It's been too long of a struggle. It's been a long struggle for an inadequate amount of aid. But I think you're really teaching us and individuals and in different disaster areas really, what that local community-based effort really looks like. And so I appreciate that. I can stop there, Evis.